Henry, thank you so much for joining us and for your willingness to be our first person today. We have just an hour, so we'll start. And I might just mention for our audience that since you're recently retired, and this is your first time with us in first person, so
it is.
Very excited to have you here.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Henry, Nazi Germany annexed Austria in March 1938 when you were almost 2.5 years of age. And that was more than 5 months before Germany invaded Poland, starting the Second World War. Before you tell us about the annexation of Austria and what it meant for you and your family, tell us first a little bit, recognizing how young you were, a little bit about what you know about your family and your life in those years before the Anschluss, or the annexation of Austria.
Sure. I was born in Vienna, Austria in September of 1935, and my family was a Jewish family. We lived a very comfortable life. My father worked with his uncle in a leather goods store, and as I say, they were a comfortable family. We were observant Jews. We lived in a small, confined area in the city of Vienna called the 9th Bezirk, which is the 9th district. And within that district where we lived were also my mother's sister and her family, and my mother's brother and his family. So there were 3 families. I was the only child with my family, but my mother's sister had 2 girls, and my mother's brother had a daughter and a son. So we were all very, very close. And the children all played together and lived a very nice life. Interestingly enough, about a half a block down from where we lived was the Sigmund Freud house, which is now a museum, but that's where Sigmund Freud lived. And my father would tell me from time to time that he and his friends would play cards with Sigmund Freud. And guess what? My father would say, he seems a little crazy. But that's the way it was. And so it was a very, very nice life. And, we really had a good family relationship with my cousins and my aunts and my uncles.
Henry, I believe your father was originally from Czechoslovakia, your mother from Hungary.
Correct.
What brought them to Austria?
Well, conditions back in Hungary and Czechoslovakia during the before and following the First World War were not very good. So many families left their homes, which my father and mother did, and they moved to Vienna, which they thought would give them a better life. And that's how they both arrived there.
When you were born, I believe your parents had been married for 10 years. Did they delay having children because of their getting established in Vienna, or?
I never asked that question of my parents for obvious reasons, but I don't know why. But it just so happened they were married in 1925, and I came along in 1935, about 10 years later.
German troops marched into Austria on March 12, 1938, in what is known as the Anschluss, or the annexation of Austria by Nazi Germany. Although you were very young at the time, tell us what you can about the Anschluss and what it meant for your parents, your family, and other Jews in Austria.
Yes. As I say, I was a young child, and so I have a very, very vague memory of the conditions in Vienna following the invasion, or the Onschloss, as it's called in Vienna, during that period of time. But what I do remember, and some of the things that I'm going to be talking about, are things that I learned later from my parents. Once the Anschluss occurred, we were all required, whenever we went out of our apartment or our homes, to wear a Jewish star on our clothing. And I had a cousin who was about 10 years older than I, my cousin Mary. And she had very blonde hair and blue eyes, and she looked very Aryan. So I'm told that at night we would send her out on the street to try to bring food and necessities to our homes, because she could probably get away with it, and she would apparently take her Jewish star and somehow turn her collar over it and hide it, and apparently she was never stopped. And I remember that very vividly, that's what occurred. But other than that, I don't really have very good memory of anything having to do with the Onschloss. I will just tell you anecdotally, when my family all arrived in America many years later, I talked to my cousin Mary. She converted. She gave up her Jewish religion, became a Methodist, as I recall. And when I asked her, why did you do that, Cousin Mary? She said, well, I never wanted to have to be a Jewish again and have to walk those streets and fear. She said it was just horrible. I just never wanted to experience that again. And I did remember that.
It's not hard to imagine how terrifying
she was terrified
to do what she did, the responsibility.
She was terrified.
You do have one memory of the Anschluss, the occupation itself, when the Nazis actually marched into Vienna. You witnessed that.
I did. One day, I do remember being in my apartment when I heard drums beating and I heard soldiers marching. And when I went to look out the window, there were the German troops marching right in front of our apartment building. I thought it was exciting. I thought it was a parade. But when I looked over at my mother, she was hysterical. She was crying. And at that point in time, my parents realized that it was very late. In September, this was already very, very late in the game in terms of people didn't want to leave their homes unless they really had to. And some of the people in Vienna, and I think my parents included, thought, well, maybe this would blow over, it wouldn't be so bad, maybe we can stay here. But when those soldiers were marching in front of the building, they realized then and there that it was time to go. And that's when my father started the process of going to the consulate daily, almost daily as I'm told.
Henry, before we turn to that, let me ask you this. For our audience's benefit, we've referred to the Anschluss, or the annexation of Austria by Germany. Just briefly, what did that mean? What did it mean to be annexed? Because the war hadn't begun yet. What did that mean?
The war hadn't begun yet. They just, Hitler, and they just took over our country. They made it part of Germany.
So just took it over.
Just took it over, just as they later took over Poland and Czechoslovakia and the other European countries.
It's just the later ones resulted in war being declared.
Poland is the one that resulted in the war, exactly. Austria didn't necessarily bring on the war, but it was the first of the conquests of the German Third Reich at that point in time.
And as you started to tell us, of course, with the annexation or the Anschluss, that really galvanized your parents, your father, into action.
That triggered them to take action because they realized that it was very, very late and we had to try to leave, make sure that we were able to get it.
Tell us what he did to try to get you out of there.
Okay, so with that, you had to have three things. You had to have papers to be able to exit Vienna. You had to have an affidavit from someone in America who would be financially responsible for you, and that was this Mr. Rice, an act of charity, if you will. And you also had to have a relative, a close family relative that was already living in the United States. Fortunately, my mother's brother, Joe, my Uncle Joe, he had come to America shortly after the First World War and was already settled in New York, so we had my uncle living in New York, we had the affidavit from Mr. Rice, and now my father had to go to the consulate to get the exit papers. And that took days, weeks, and months because of the numbers of people that were trying to get away at this time. And also, there was a lot of red tape and bureaucracy involved.
Well, you had a relative, your mother's brother, living in New York, so that made sense to think about the U.S. Do you know if your parents thought of, knowing how difficult it was to get here, do you know if they thought about or tried to look into going to any other countries?
I don't know that. I don't know that. I'm very happy that they chose America.
Right. Absolutely. Mr. Rice, as we said earlier, an unknown person, and so he makes $26 a week. Who was this guy?
I have no clue. I mean, it's just an absolute wonder that remarkable that he would do such a kind thing. And I'm sure, I'm not sure, but I have a strong feeling that Mr. Rice, probably not knowing us, may have signed a similar affidavit for other families as well. It was just a charitable act on his part. Very, very kind. I tried to locate him, by the way, Bill, and some years back, and I was never able to find him. I wanted to personally contact him if I could.
One of the things that I noticed when we saw the affidavit on the large screen as opposed to, a picture, noticed that it said his occupation, he was also associated with the leather industry. So there must have been some
Maybe
route
that
that
triggered
way
it.
to-
I have no idea. My father, as I say, was in the leather industry in Europe, having worked with his uncle in the leather goods store.
So now you do have the affidavit. Your uncle, I believe, was able to provide a visa, and yet that wasn't enough. I think your words were, you told me your father later said to you, actually getting all the things we needed to get out was a nightmare. What did that involve for him?
He, as I say, every day, I understand he went and tried to get the necessary papers, and there were long lines. I've seen pictures of lines of people lined up in front of the consulate. Amazing. And ultimately, though, he was able to, the first thing that happened was he was able to get an exit visa, which only had his name on it. And my father was a very meticulous man, and he would inquire, well, why is my name on it, and why is not my wife's name and my son's name on this paper? And he was assured that it wasn't necessary, that he could leave, and so on and so forth, but he persisted. And fortunately, he was able to obtain an exit paper that had my mother's name and my name included, and that was when we were able to finally leave Vienna.
And the time involved in that was from March 1938?
Months, yeah.
Over a year?
Over a year.
Over a
yeah.
year, until
Finally
August.
was able to do that.
In August of 1939, as your father's now has the paperwork together, right about that time, your family is forced out of the apartment where you lived. Do you know anything about that and what they did? Here, they're still not out of Austria. They're out of their home. What did they do?
Well, all I know, what I'm told, is that we left in the middle of the night from Vienna, taken by train to Paris. That was the first stop on our journey to America. When we arrived in Paris, there were constant air raids. We were there, like, as I recall from hearing from my parents, 3 or 4 days and nights, and most of that time was spent in an air raid shelter because of the constant air raids. I have a vivid recollection and memory of one event. We were staying in some room or some place, and when the air raid started, my father picked me up, and he ran carrying me to the air raid shelter, and he lost a shoe. And I remember on the way to the air raid shelter, my father losing the shoe, didn't stop to pick up the shoe, and then somehow continued running to the air raid shelter. Sometimes when we got to the air raid shelters, we were late, and the air raid shelters were already full, and we couldn't get in, so we went into the metro, and we spent the night riding in the metro while
Just going back and forth.
Back and forth during the air raids, correct.
I'm going to take you back for a moment to the last days in Austria. You were forced out of your apartment, and I think you went and hid with a friend of your father's for that 1 week.
I'm told that my father had a friend, this is before the Germans came into power, had a friend who became a German soldier or officer, a non-Jew, and he actually took us into his home for a day or two, or however long it took before we could board the train that would take us to Paris. That's what I was told by my father.
Did you ever learn what happened to that friend?
I did not learn about what happened to that family. I was a very risky, thing for that family to have done, obviously.
But you did get out, you got to Paris, and from
Paris. Now, here's the interesting thing. Once we were able to leave Paris, we moved on to Southampton, England. Southampton, England was the port city in England where we were to board the ship that would take us to America. Because of this long delay in getting the papers and getting all the things together that were needed to leave Austria, we arrived in Southampton too late. And that ship has already departed. Guess what? That ship was ultimately sunk by German U-boats.
On that voyage, right?
On that voyage.
On that voyage. Yeah.
We were too late to be on that ship. So I always say I consider myself very fortunate to be able to have left this Holocaust and then to have missed the ship that was sunk by German U-boats. Now, we were able to, and there were a number of other families that arrived in Southampton late and missed that ship, and as a result, we were put on a ship called the Aquitania. You've earlier, I think, seen a picture of myself and the other two boys on that ship, And we, if you noticed, we were required also to wear our life vests. We had to wear them day and night, sleep because we were also being chased by these German U-boats. Fortunately, we were able to zigzag across the Atlantic. It took quite a while, that trip, and we were able to outrun.
It was like a 3-week journey.
It was several, 2 or 3 week journey, as I recall, because of the zigzagging to be able to avoid those German U-boats. As a matter of fact, I don't know if you noticed it, there was a photograph of a temporary ladder that they put up on our deck, and we were told that in the event of a torpedo strike, we were to climb up the ladder to a higher deck to a safer place on the ship. Fortunately, we didn't have to do that.
Do you recall or know anything else about your trip across the Atlantic?
I don't recall anything about the trip, except that my mother told me that I spent the entire time on a rocking horse in the hull of the ship.
That's a sturdy...
It must have been fun.
Yeah.
What I do remember is coming...
The ship rocking wasn't enough. Get on the rocking horse.
What I do remember is coming into the New York Harbor and seeing the Statue of... I didn't know what it was, but there was a Statue of Liberty. And I remember now all of the people on our ship that were in our refugees were on the top deck of the ship, and everybody's very happy to be an American, screaming America. We made it to America. Very, very exciting. I remember that.
And the press covered it.
And it was it was also in that photograph that was shown earlier. Mm-hmm.
You mentioned to me before you came up here this morning that the 2 refugee boys that were with you, I
tried to locate them. They were the Manfred boys. I've forgotten their first names. Manfred and Weiner was their last name, W-E-I-N-E-R. I've not been able to locate them. We were, just put together on that ship, and we spent a lot of time together, obviously.
So tell us, Henry, you fled your home country. You come to the United States. What did you have with you?
When we arrived here?
Yep.
We arrived here with very little. We left Vienna with basically the clothes on our back in the middle of the night. And the few things that I do remember that we were able to take out were my mother's iron. Don't know why she was so hung up on that, but she did bring her iron. And my father was a big opera buff, and he had his opera glasses, like binoculars, small pair of binoculars.
She at least had something to use.
That was what we had.
And almost no money.
No money, and let me say, no money. First, we were taken to Ellis Island, and we were processed at Ellis Island. And because we had no money, we were fortunate, however, to be able to stay with some family, my mother's sister, who had come to America the year before, and they were already living in New York. So we were able to stay with them for a period of time until my father was able to find a job, and he found that job in the leather factory in Wilmington, Delaware.
And I want to come back to that in just a moment. With you now safely in New York with your parents, the family members that you had been so close to, the cousins and the uncles and aunts that you described earlier in Vienna, tell us what happened to them, because they were able to get out.
Yes, my cousins, my mother's sisters, two girls, they were on the kinder transport. They were sent to England. That is, my aunt and uncle just put them on a boat, not knowing whether they would ever see them again, and sent them off to England. Fortunately, after the war, or at some point in time, maybe even before the war ended, they were able to reunite with their parents that were already living in New York. Mm-hmm. My mother's brother, she had a brother that also was from Vienna, and couldn't get into the United States because of the small quotas under the Roosevelt administration. However, they were able to get into Australia. Australia at that time was a fairly new country, and they were looking to, my uncle was an engineer, and they were looking to develop the country, so they were fortunate. And I still have cousins living in Australia today. Mm-hmm.
So, and we'll talk a little bit later about other family members who did not get out.
That's
We'll
right.
come back to that. So here you are in September 1939, you're in the United States. War is now underway in Europe, because Poland has been invaded by the Nazis and the Russians. You're 4 years old. You started to tell us that you moved in with your uncle and his family. Tell us about coming to the U.S., what it was like for you to get started and begin a new life here.
My father, as I say, we were staying with some family. So what happened was there was some sort of a leather factory originally in Philadelphia. So my father would stay in Philadelphia and work in a leather factory in Philadelphia and come back to New York and be with myself and with my mother on the weekend. And that went on for a while until he found a permanent position in, as I say, in Wilmington, Delaware, where we finally settled. And it was easy for me. I went right through school. I picked up English just like that. You know, as a young child, it's much easier. My parents had a more difficult time. They went to night school. They learned the English language. They had to make sure that they had enough history of America to be able to obtain citizenship. I'll tell you a cute story. My mother picked up the English language a lot quicker than my father. My father took a little longer. And one day I remember my mother saying to my father, his name was Hugo, Hugo, when someone says to you or asks you, how do you feel? Your response should be, fine, thank you, how are you? And somebody says, how are you? You say, fine, thank you, how are you? Some short time after that, we went to a doctor's visit with my father. You don't know what's coming.
I do, and I can't help but smile.
The doctor says to my father, Hugo, how are your bowels? My father said, fine, thank you, how are yours? True story.
Henry, do you know when your parents were here, both when they first arrived and as they got themselves established in New York and then moved on to Wilmington, were they able to have contact with any of the family members in Austria?
Yes. Strangely, there were a number of other families from Germany and from Austria who settled in Delaware. And so my father and mother were able to socialize with them, so they were able to sort of grow into the system by having friends in Wilmington. As I said, my father was working in a leather factory, and my mother, who was an excellent cook, cooked for other families. And yours truly was the delivery boy. I was the originator of Wheels on Meals, except it was meals by foot, not on wheels. I delivered the dinners to the various families in the neighborhood that my mother would cook for.
That was to help make ends meet.
To help make ends meet. My father never made a lot of money, but he was okay with that.
And I was curious about, was your family, were they able to stay in touch with the relatives that were in Austria? Did you know that they had been able to get out and go to Australia? And the other family members, was there any communication?
For a short time, my father was able to send some kind of care packages to one of his sisters, his sister Wilma, but then after a time that stopped, and I assumed that that's when she was picked up and sent to a concentration camp. And if you'd like, I'll tell you about my father's siblings.
Well, let's come back to that in just a minute,
okay.
if we can.
Yeah.
I also wonder if maybe if your father was able to have some communication with his sister, if we were not in the war, of course, until after Pearl Harbor in December 1941. I would guess that all communication with Nazi-occupied countries, and therefore the people that were there, probably stopped completely after that. The
only one I remember is the sister Wilma that he had some contact with. I think he had lost contact with his other siblings.
Okay. In 1941, your mother had your sister, Shirley.
Right.
Did she grow up knowing much about what the family had been through, what you had experienced?
She did, I'm sure she did, and she also picked up the German language. My parents would speak German most of the time at home, and so she speaks fluent German even today, much more. I've forgotten a lot because I had left to go to school, and she was around much longer, and she speaks German much better than I do.
I do have to ask you about this. Your birth name is Heinz, and you're called Henry.
Yes.
There's a story there.
There's a story there. My given name was Heinz, H-E-I-N-Z, which is a typical German name. And I'm told that when my mother came to America and went to the supermarket and noticed Heinz ketchup, Heinz baked beans, Heinz mustard, she said, "You're from now on going to be called Henry." And that's how Oh, Miss Henry.
Yep.
No more Heinz. I don't know. Maybe the fact that it was a German name may have had some part in it, but that's the story she told.
Well, I'm curious about that because we're at war with Germany, and you have a German name. Your family has a German name. You're in the United States. Did you ever experience any sort of hostility or anything like that?
No, I did not.
No, you did not.
Never did. Never did. I was accepted. We lived in a very sort of a mixed neighborhood. We had Jews, non-Jews, blacks, whites, you name it, and everybody got along. It was just beautiful.
Yeah, and I think you shared with me that you don't remember experiencing anti-Semitism.
Not at all.
Not at all.
Not at all.
Not at all. Tell us a little bit more about school for you, because you were able to start once you came here.
Yeah, I went right through. I started in kindergarten, went all the way through school there in Delaware, and then to the University of Delaware. And then I came here following that to attend law school at Georgetown University, and I've been in the Washington area ever since that time.
Of course, the war ended in May of 1945. You'd been in the country now for some years at that point. At what point do you think your parents and then you really understand the full enormity of what happened in Europe with the Holocaust and also what happened to the family members that were not able to get out?
Well, I started to say my father had 3 sisters and a brother. They all wound up in the camps. And some years later, when I was a teenager, I was driving my parents through a small town in New Jersey, Vineland, New Jersey. Some of you may be familiar with Vineland, New Jersey. And my father asked me to stop at a farm, a chicken farm. There were a number of chicken farms there. And somehow, and I don't understand why, but some of the survivors of the Holocaust who survived wound up in this area of Vineland, New Jersey, and owned and operated these chicken farms. So my father asked me to stop the car. He wanted to buy some fresh eggs at this particular farmhouse. And when he came out, he was crying. "What's the matter, Dad?" Can you imagine this? The woman who owned this particular farm was one of my father's sister's cellmate in the concentration camp. And she proceeds to tell my father that a German soldier working in the camp gave my father's sister a poison pill to take shortly before she was going to be taken to the gas chamber. That's how my father found out about how he lost one of his sisters.
That's extraordinary.
And it's awful. It was a shocking thing. And then later he also learned, he received a telegram from some Jewish agency that his other sisters and his brother, they all perished in the concentration camp.
If you don't mind, say just a little bit more about that, getting that telegram, because I think, as I recall from what you told me, you and your father came home and your mom had just opened it.
Yes. Where I went to grammar school was right across the street from where my father's factory was, and so often we would meet at lunchtime and we would walk a few blocks from there to our home, to our apartment, to have lunch together. When we got there, my mother was crying profusely. She was the one who had received the telegram, and she told my father and me that what had happened to my father's siblings, that they had perished.
And that was the war? That was right after the war?
That was after the war.
Right after the war.
That was after the war.
You said earlier that, your father was working in Wilmington in the leather factory. He wasn't earning a lot of money, but you said he was so happy to be here.
My father was so grateful. Both my parents were, but my father particularly was so happy to be in the United States. I mean, we have people here at the Holocaust Museum that are survivors who, they tell me that they just got on a boat. They had no idea where they were going to go. Under the Roosevelt administration, we had some small quotas here at that time in the United States, but we were fortunate to be able to come to this country. My father was so grateful. He just couldn't be happier to be in America. He was so happy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I want you to share, if you will, something you told me. When you were in college, you joined ROTC and decided that you wanted to go to officer candidate school. So you're already in ROTC, and you get accepted to officer candidate school. Yeah,
well, at a state university, at the University of Delaware, you had to spend 2 years as a ROTC. It was mandatory. And if you wanted to go on to become an officer, you could voluntarily do that. And I was interested in doing that. And I was put on a train headed for, I think it was Fort Bliss, Texas, for officers candidate training school. And the captain, whoever it was in charge, the officer came up and said, "Where's Weil?" "Right here, sir." "Are you an American citizen?" I said, "Yes, sir." He says, "Where are your citizenship papers?" I said, "Sir, I became a citizen as a child when my parents were naturalized, which was the law as I understood it, and I don't have citizenship papers." And I think even if I had papers, I wouldn't have had them with me on that trip to Texas. But he said, off the train, and that was the end of my military career. He sent me back. I'm kind of sorry that I didn't get to serve. I really would have enjoyed that.
Right. You, of course, as we said earlier, you just recently retired from your law practice after a very, very long practice and are now involved with our museum. Tell us what it means for you to now not only be associated with the museum, be a volunteer here, but also to share publicly what you and your family went through.
I only wish that I had done this before. I mean, it means the world to me to come here once a week, sometimes twice a week, to share a story. My story is so somewhat unlike many of the other survivors. I had it relatively easy compared to some of the other people that you'll run into here at the museum who actually were interned in a concentration camp and somehow survived. I was one of the lucky few who was able to get away. So, but nevertheless, it's still part of the overall story. And so it makes me feel so good to be able to share this story with people who are coming to the museum who are interested in learning about the Holocaust. It just gives me such pleasure to do that. It means an awful lot.
I also wanted to ask you, Henry, that growing up during the war in Wilmington and then going on to high school after the war and then college in Delaware, did you learn much about the Holocaust in school, and were others interested in hearing about your experience, or did you share that at that time?
Not really. I think the gist of it is that my knowledge came essentially from my parents. Mm-hmm. We didn't have Holocaust studies in school when I was in school, and I learned about the Holocaust from my parents and from reading about it, from coming to the museum, and just
later in life.
Later in life, yeah. I had a very, very good, fortunate life. I had a career. I had my family here. I had my children here, my daughter, and I had a wonderful marriage for 35 years, and now I was fortunate enough after my wife had passed away, I was able to meet a wonderful lady who was also from Wilmington, Delaware, that we knew each other as young children. So, I mean, I've had a blessed life. I just can't imagine why I've been so blessed. I asked myself often, why me? I don't have an answer for that.
Henry, you've been back to Austria. Will you tell us about that?
About 40 years ago, and I'm taking you back now to like the 70s, my wife insisted that we go back. She wanted to see where I lived and how this all came about.
And up to that point, you hadn't been interested?
I never had any interest in doing that. So anyway, she, as most women do, usually prevail. And I went to Austria. Well, before I got to Austria, we were on an airplane landing, and the first stop, you couldn't get a direct flight, so we had to stop in Munich, Germany, land in Munich, Germany. And as soon as that plane started to descend in Munich, Germany, I had some really strange feelings, a little timid, and I didn't really want to step foot on German soil. But when I looked out the window as we were really landing, I looked out, and there was El Al Airlines right on the tarmac. So I said to myself,
that's the Israeli airline. Yep.
El Al, which is the airline of Israel, and I said, boy, if it's good enough for El Al, it's going to be good enough for me. I'm going to be okay here.
Yeah.
So we did. We landed there, and then we went on to Vienna, Austria. Now, I had a photograph of my apartment house that my parents left for me. So we went over to that apartment building, and it was just like just as it was in the picture. Everything else in that neighborhood was still bombed out from the war. It had never been rebuilt, but that apartment house was still standing miraculously there.
This was 25
This was like 1975, somewhere along in there. Anyway, so it's a big wooden door, and I'm banging on the door to try to get somebody's attention, and a lady comes down, and she says, who are you? And when I tell her who I am, she says, oh my God, she says, you are that quote unquote nice Jewish family that left in the middle of the night. I remember my parents always talking and asking, I wonder if they made it, I wonder if they made it. And so happy to see you. And I said, that's very kind. And she showed me around a little bit. And then she said, now would you like to go up and see your apartment? I said, absolutely. Now picture this. This is 1975 or somewhere along in there. She said, well, the Gestapo officer, Herr Russo, and his wife, Frau Russo, are still living there. They'd love to meet you. And I said,
Incredible.
that's not going to happen. I didn't say that to her, but that was my only trip back to Vienna.
I mean, that's astonishing.
It was just, how this man was not being tried as a war criminal, or how he was still living in that apartment that my parents had, and apparently had all of their possessions, I have no idea.
And this woman's lack of awareness to say, not only are you the nice Jewish
Well,
family that left, but they'd love to meet you.
Yeah, I think she didn't mean it. She wasn't being mean-spirited. I think she thought maybe...
Probably genuine.
So
but
genuine, yeah, genuine. Yeah, that's true.
And now there's some consideration that you might actually go back at some point.
There is a organization called Jewish Welcome who they bring survivors back to Vienna at their expense, and they spend a week there, and they show you around different things, and you know, try to make reparations in some way for what you have lost. And so I'm on the waiting list. If they decide,
Because you had a family member, right?
Yeah, I may go back again.
Yeah, and you had a family member who actually did that, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
My cousins have already done that, so I may do that.
You may do
but
that.
I'm retired.
Okay. What, when you retire? What about your parents? Did they ever go back to Austria?
They never went back to Austria. No. they
Any
did not.
interest?
No.
No.
No. No. They were very bitter. They're very, very bitter.
Other than that, how would you describe their lives as here in America?
I'd say they had a wonderful life.
Yeah.
They really had a wonderful, blessed life here in America. They were just thrilled to be here. They had family here. They had friends here. They just...
When did you lose them?
My father passed away in 1978 at the age of 78. My mother passed away in 1970 at the age of 64.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, they were very happy to be American citizens, very proud.
One last question for you before we have a chance to turn to our audience for questions. You shared with me that now that you come to the museum and sit at the survivor's desk and talk with lots of folks from all over, that you are especially just really impressed and fascinated by young people and their interest. Will you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, it means so much to me, not only with young people, but especially with the young people that are so knowledgeable. I have 8th graders that come. I sit at the survivor's desk usually on Monday afternoon, and they ask questions that are absolutely very, very fascinating questions about the Holocaust. It pleases me to no end to know that they're learning about the Holocaust. It's so important. As I say, when I was in school, we didn't have any courses or lessons in Holocaust. So I'm just so amazed at some of the questions that are asked, and it's so important for particularly for young people not to forget, to know about the Holocaust, so as that we never forget what happened.
That's a great segue to our audience, I think. Should we turn to our audience?
Sure, that'd be nice.
We'd love to have you ask some questions of Henry if you are so inclined. We have microphones in each aisle. We do ask that you go to the microphone if you have a question. Try to make your question as brief as you can, and then I will repeat the question just to be sure that we hear it correctly and all of you hear it as well. So we would love to encourage you to do so, and we'll look for a brave soul who's willing to come up and take the microphone. And here comes our first brave soul. In a second, there we go. Yes, sir. And I will try to repeat it as best I can.
I had a question about Mr. Rice. I know you haven't met him, but what were the obligations he was assuming as part of providing this affidavit, and was there any additional assistance or engagement with him once you made it here to the U.S.?
Thank you for that. The question is, with Mr. Rice, describe a little bit more about what obligation was he actually taking on by signing that affidavit, And then once you arrived, was there any other assistance provided to you and your family from anywhere?
No, as I say, Mr. Rice made $26 a week, according to the affidavit. An affidavit, as you know, is a document that's signed under oath, which meant that he was legally obligated to lend support to my family. How he was going to be able to do that, I have no idea, and how many other affidavits he signed for other folks, I don't know, but I just assumed that it was just something that he felt like he needed to do out of the goodness of his heart. But my family received no other help. My father never made much money working in the leather factory. He worked as a piece worker where he had to grain the hides in the factory, and he was paid by the number of hides that he would grain every day, and it was very hard manual labor. But no, we were able to survive.
I think you mentioned this earlier. For the first year or thereabouts, before you moved to Wilmington, he actually was working in a leather factory in Philadelphia.
He worked in Philadelphia, and he commuted during the week.
To New York.
Yes, he did.
New York.
He did that for a while until he was able to find a permanent job.
Amazing.
And we were okay. We never complained.
Okay. Yes, sir.
So, Mr. Weiss, I'd like to start just by thanking you for coming and speaking. This is a very important and incredible story. And my question, as somebody who lived through Nazi rule, especially during the annexation of Austria, what would you say are the warning signs for fascism and Nazism, and how can we help fight back against it and stop it?
Questions are, what for the audience, what do you think are sort of the warning signs of Nazism and fascism, and what can we do to address that?
Well, unfortunately, we're hearing and reading more and more about anti-Semitism in this country and around the world, even in Europe today, and it's very frightening. It's very rampant on college campuses. Unfortunately, I've never experienced it personally, but I'm just so concerned about what I'm hearing and reading, and I think the importance of this museum is that we should never forget what happened. Once we forget, it's very conceivable that it would happen again. I'm really worried not for myself. I'm worried for my children and my grandchildren that they're going to be growing up in this kind of an atmosphere.
And that's why you being here today is so important.
That's why I think all of us being here, all the survivors, I think it's what motivates us to come here and give of our time.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Yes, sir.
First off, I wanted to thank you as well. I live on Bradford Street in Haverhill, Massachusetts, about 10 doors down from where Mr. Rice lived.
Say that again.
I live on Bradford Street in Haverhill, Massachusetts, about 10 doors down from where Mr. Rice had on his...
Oh, is that right? Okay.
That was stunning. Similar to the previous question, I'm curious, aside from when you were describing your parents' feelings, you're so generous and kind. Is there an anger in there somewhere about what happened and what went on?
Great, good question. Thank you. The first part of the comment was that he grew up just within blocks of where Mr. Rice's address is on here. And the second question is that you're so generous and kind. Is there in there somewhere, I think the word you used is hatred or anger, or I would add that to it, is because you are so kind and generous.
Well, I don't know about that, but
we won't ask family members.
No, you mean, why do I come here to?
No, more like, is there, I guess the question really was, do you carry internally hatred or feelings as a result of the Holocaust and the war?
No, I will say this. Growing up in my home in Delaware with my parents, of course, we were full of hate for what had happened to our people. But I have learned now, I'm of a little bit of a different opinion. For example, I had a gentleman I was at the survivor's desk a few weeks ago, and as I was speaking with a group of people, he was crying. And I asked him, I said, "Sir, why are you crying?" And he responded by telling me that his grandfather, I believe it was a high-ranking Nazi officer, and he felt so guilty. And I was trying to make him feel a little bit better. I don't know how successful I was. I said, "Sir, I've learned one thing. I do not hate. I forgive, because this generation has to be forgiven. They cannot take on the sins of their fathers and their grandfathers." I said, "I can forgive, but we cannot forget." And that's the way I feel about it.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
I know that Ellis Island tended to be one of the major passageways for people coming into the United States, so I was wondering if you had any experiences at Ellis Island in New York.
Say that one more time for me.
Ellis Island in
Ellis
New York.
Island. Oh, your experience at Ellis Island.
Do you have any experiences there?
Yes. Tell us about Ellis Island.
I forgot to mention that. Yes.
Yeah.
When we arrived in the United States back in 1939, it was a requirement that you were processed in Ellis Island, and we did that. And in Ellis Island, as I was told later, we had to get certain shots, and then we also had to do some paperwork. And I think we were there like overnight, as I recall. I don't remember this personally, but I think my parents told me that we were there overnight in order to complete the process. And once we were able to, once we completed the process, we were released to come into the country. Ellis Island, by the way, is now a museum, and I would highly recommend it to you folks that if you should ever be in New York, you should visit Ellis Island. It's fascinating. And as a matter of fact, on one of the walls is a big diagram of my ship, the Aquitania, on one of the walls. And you'll also find a plaque in my name and my mother's name and my father's name at Ellis Island now.
Something to look for, absolutely. So we have time for a couple more questions. Yes, sir.
Thank you for talking to us today. I've read that the Nazis were so efficient at digging into your family tree that converting to Christianity wouldn't save you. If you had 2 Jewish grandparents, you were on the train, so it were. Anyways, also, my grandfather had a similar story as yours, except he was a small child, but he was leaving Tsarist Russia, and he was also processed through Ellis Island. But one salient feature was that he never spoke about it, and his parents never spoke about it. Their attitude was, we're in America now, let's leave that behind us. So my question to you is, the poison pill story where you really started to appreciate the enormity of what you had escaped? Or was it a constant source of dinner conversation? Or did they necessarily kind of shield you? Like they wanted you to have like a new life in a new land, as it were.
Question, if I can paraphrase just a little bit. His grandparents escaped from Russia, came from Russia, went to Ellis Island, and never spoke about it. When you were growing up, what was the kind of the culture around speaking about it, both within the family and maybe the community? Was it something that was spoken about much, or was there an attitude, you're here, you're safe, let's move on? What was kind of the atmosphere in terms of how one spoke about the horrors that were left behind?
I didn't have that experience, I have to say. We didn't talk about it much at home. As I say, my father, most of the time that we spoke about the Holocaust, grieved for his lost siblings, and that's about it. But and he didn't complain about us having to leave Vienna. He was happy to be in this country. So we didn't have that experience, I'm sorry to say.
Okay. One last question, sir.
Okay. In the news, we have the camps on the southern border, and people have described them as concentration camps. How do you feel about that?
I'm going to take the liberty of sort of diverting us from that, just because we're a museum and we're going to try to avoid political commentary if we can. But I think the broader question relates to your concern about things happening in the world around us and your worries about that.
Well, I worry about when I see terrible things happening in the world. Nothing compares to the Holocaust. This is unique in history, and God willing, it would never happen again. But there are people that are still killing each other in Syria and Yemen and places like that. And that's troubling, that we haven't learned much from history.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. And I think the lesson is for us to come to places like this museum and hear people like Henry Weil. We're going to conclude the program in just a moment. I'm going to turn back to Henry for him to conclude our program for us. I want to thank all of you for being with us very much. Remind you that we'll have programs each Wednesday and Thursday until August 8th. All of our programs will be available on the museum's YouTube channel. So if you can't come back in person, you can watch our programs on TV, so to speak, on the YouTube channel. So we hope that you'll do that very much. When Henry finishes, two comments I want to make. One is that our photographer, Joel, is going to come up on the stage and he's going to take a picture of Henry with you as the background. So we need you to stay because it makes for a great photo for Henry of being here. That's one. Secondly, you may have other questions you want to ask. If you've asked one or you haven't yet, after Henry finishes, he will stay up here on the stage, and we invite you to come up here, please do that, and ask him a question, shake his hand, have your photograph taken with him. We welcome that, so please know we'd like you to do that if you'd like to do that. It's our tradition at First Person that our first person has the last word. So with that, I'm going to turn to Henry to close today's program.
Thank you very much, Bill, and thank you all for coming and listening to the story, and thank you for coming to the museum. I think it's an experience that you will never forget. I have said this before, I come to the museum to be able to share my story, not as significant a survivor story as some of the other survivors, but nevertheless it's important to me. And I would like to, as I say particularly to the young people that come and talk with us, that we need to forgive but not forget. I am such a blessed person to have had the life that I have had. I just couldn't be a happier person and a better life. It's just been wonderful, and I thank God. My father imparted this to me when I was old enough to learn what he was telling me. He says, I want you to do three things for me for being in America. One, I want you to say your prayers every day, and I still do. He said, number two, never eat, as being Jewish, never eat pork. I don't. And number three, never smoke on the Sabbath. That was good advice back even then, never smoke on the Sabbath. But I didn't do that. So I'm just a blessed person. I'm so happy to be here today. And thank you so much for being here with me. Thanks.